Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'm chatting with the great Doug Casey. Guys, I'm super excited for this interview because whenever Doug comes on, our audience can't seem to get enough of him. In this interview, we discuss the growing gap between the standard of living of young people and old people. We also discuss what's happening with the Middle East and an effort to dethrone the US dollar by China, Iran, and Russia. And also, we get into what's happening in the gold and copper markets and where Doug thinks that they are heading. All right, everybody, enjoy the interview. Doug, thanks so much for joining us again.
Well, it's nice to be back here with you.
So I want to start off the interview with a little story here. So the other day, I'm driving out to my parents' house with my family. My wife's scrolling through her phone and she brings up this thing called the World Happiness Index. Not sure if you've heard of it.
Yes, I have.
And originally I sort of said, okay, yeah, I've sort of heard of these things. And she's always suggesting to me that maybe she send me some links, and we have a media site. So I'm like, okay, send it. But then she starts scrolling through it and she said something that I thought was just really fascinating. And that was that if you look at Canadians who are above 60, Canada ranks 8th in the world on the happiness index. But if you look at Canadians who are under 30, Canada ranks 58th on the world happiness index. We want to talk about the US. For people over 60, it's 10th in the world, the US ranks for people over 60. But for people under 30, the US ranks 62nd on the world happiness index. What do you think that this tells us about what's happened with Western society?
Well, Western society and Western civilization's in big trouble. But it brings up another question that I think is logical. What country has the unhappiest people over 60? If Canada and the US have relatively happy people that are over 60, what countries have unhappy people over 60? Do you recall, or you don't have the survey?
No, I'd have to bring it up. If you give me a second here, I can. World Happiness Index, the 2024 report. Happiness age and summary. Okay. Where is this here?
Of course, I'm always suspicious of things of that nature. How many people did they sample to get their statistics? And exactly what questions and other parameters did they ask? So you can take these things at face value or not. But I think in general, Canadians and Americans are getting less happy, especially the younger ones. So it resonates. There's probably some general truth to that survey. Young people can't afford houses. That tends to make them unhappy. It's hard for them to save money. Why? Because the currencies, both Canadian and American, are being inflated out of existence. So if you work in a country, you save in that country's currency, and if it loses value, it means that you don't have a future. So I suppose it's true.
So it's just to give you some bit of a taste. They sample about 1,000 people in every country, and it looks at factors such as GDP per capita, social support, healthy life expectancy, freedom to make life choices, generosity, perceptions of corruption. So I don't have the specific questions in front of me or how they rank it, but it's as a young person living in Canada and somebody who follows social media, I find it really fascinating because when I look at what's happened, in my opinion, politically and economically and how the system's been set up, is that at least here in Canada, it feels like we've really thrown young people under the bus. We're bringing in, I think it was 1.2 million immigrants last year in Canada. That would be the equivalent of America bringing in 12 million people, give or take, in immigration in just one single year. And what does that do? It allows for the grocery stores to employ people on cheaper wages, Uber drivers, restaurants, you name it. And What that does is that means that the young people who live here are now going up and competing against people who are coming from a different country where they'll just take effectively any work that wants to pay them. So the typical laws of economics no longer apply when you are bringing in that level of immigration and people who are just desperate to eat.
Well, you're quite correct. And it's actually worse than that when you get right down to it, because a lot of the immigration to Canada is from Muslim countries. And the work ethic, at least among men in Muslim countries, is not the same as it is in Western countries. So that I think what's happening, especially in Canada, is a lot of these new immigrants are going on welfare. This is certainly true in Europe and in England. The migrants expect to get free housing, free money, free food, and it draws the wrong kind of people to Canada, and for that matter, the U.S. Because in the 19th century, the early 20th century, if you came to either Canada or the U.S., you had to pay your own way somehow. And when you arrived, you had to make your own way. Nobody gave you anything. That's not the way it works today. In the US, we have millions of people walking across the southern border every year. They come from all over the world, everywhere. And when they arrive, they're given many or most. It's very unclear what the exact numbers of people that are getting what kind of subsidies are from whom. The US government, from NGOs, which are mostly subsidized by the US government. But they get a monthly income, they get a cell phone, they're shipped, they're flown to places and given places to live free. I mean, you're inviting exactly the wrong kind of people to the country, not entrepreneurial freedom seekers, but people that are looking for a free ride and to be mooches. So, yeah, it's actually worse than you said, Steve.
And just to follow up that idea, I have to say that when you go on, this is just one of my favorite stats, and I'm not going to nail this stat perfectly, but when you go on companiesmarketcap.com and you look it up by country, and you go to the US and you look up the top 20 companies by market cap in the US, you're going to find that most of them are tech companies and companies that do productive things. When you look up Canada, it's pretty much all banks and insurance companies and companies that take stuff from the ground. They don't process any of it here. They just ship it somewhere else to be processed. And then we also hear just last week, and I was telling you about this during pre-interview, there was an announcement in the Canadian budget that we are now going to be increasing capital gains taxes on people who make capital gains, whether it be from housing gains or from stock market gains. And the stock market part really hurts because this is at a time where most of the junior market companies in Canada can't catch a bid. It's very hard to get anybody to invest in any of these junior companies. And here comes Justin Trudeau with a hammer, and it's all under the guise of, we need to tax the rich more. It's all rich people's fault, when you got to look at it and think, well, in order for young people to have jobs, we need investment in industry. And now we're about to stifle that by increasing taxes. I mean, I know you're not Canadian, but you must be looking at what's happening here and the junior markets of which you have participated in, and be thinking, yikes! What are your thoughts on the future of commodity investing in Canada?
Well, I'm very involved in the Canadian junior resource market. And it hasn't been pretty for the last few years. Actually, I think it might be about to turn for a number of reasons. We could talk about why that might be. But Canadians have to recognize that your main enemy is the Canadian government. I mean, you earn $1 and they're going to take, I don't know what the average percentage is at what income bracket, but a substantial amount of whatever you earn goes into the maw of the state. And what the state does with that money is itself mostly destructive. And unfortunately, Canadians don't, they think Canadians more than Americans think in terms of the government being their big brother or a friendly father figure. But it's not. It's an enemy. It's like the average Canadian citizen is part of a herd of zebras and wildebeests, and the government are predators. They're treating Canadians like milk cows at this point, but if necessary, they'll treat you as a beef cow. So it's really a question of the foundations that the society is founded on. The philosophical foundations are very unsound in Canada, and they're getting worse because, as we were talking about before, by importing people from countries that don't share the values of Western civilization, I guess most Canadian immigrants come primarily from India and Pakistan, probably the two biggest sources.
It used to be China. It used to be China, and then Mr. Trudeau pissed them off. So now it's India, and recently Trudeau's pissed them off as well. So who knows who it's going to be next?
I mean, the Chinese have notoriously good work ethics, but the Indians and the Pakistanis have a totally different culture, and it's going to result in a culture clash that could get physical in the future. I lived in Canada for about 10 years in Vancouver. I've traveled all over Canada, and the changes I've noticed have been most disturbing. They really have. So, well, look at the Canadian dollar. It wasn't so long ago that the Canadian dollar sold at a premium to the US dollar. I think as high as $1.03, or perhaps a few pennies more. But now the Canadian dollar is around 72 cents and struggling and headed down. And that, at the same time as the US dollar itself is being inflated out of existence. So, yeah, there are big troubles coming in Canada, even more than in the US. And we have our own problems down here. Although I'm talking to you right now from Buenos Aires, actually, which is where I spend about half of the year, more than half the year, actually.
It's scary for me because I look at what's happening in the US where in my view, the economy is doing a lot better than it is here in Canada. And inflation actually looks a little bit higher than it actually is because Justin Trudeau introduced this carbon tax, which has raised inflation because he's just hitting everybody for using oil. And it ends up just raising the prices of everything. So the Bank of Canada can maintain the rates, but eventually that's going to work its way through the system. And what's going to happen if the Federal Reserve Bank in the U.S. is forced to keep rates high because the U.S. economy is doing well, but the Canadian economy is not doing well, and they want to lower rates because we have this housing bubble that has largely fueled our entire economy, but then by doing so, with the Federal Reserve having higher rates, you're going to crush the Canadian dollar, and then you're just going to import all this inflation in. So I think that the Bank of Canada is going to have a real problem thanks to the Liberal government. Now, look, I'm just that's just my opinion, but it seems to me like the writing's on the wall every time we get job data.
Well, you're correct about that, but I'll go further. It's that, let me say something that might shock a lot of people. The Canadian Central Bank, the Bank of Canada, should be abolished. It serves no useful purpose. It manipulates interest rates, which are the most important rate or price in the entire economy, the price of money. They manipulate these things arbitrarily. They print up more Canadian dollars for political reasons. The Bank of Canada is really in charge of the slow motion collapse of the dollar. Since the currency of a country is in effect the stock of a country, it's going into collapse. So it's very sad. Canada needs a major makeover, and I can't think of any prime ministers in Canada that I would say were really good guys offhand. But Justin Trudeau is certainly the worst one that Canada's ever had. He may be worse than Biden as president of the US, which is saying something. But we have to ask ourselves the question, how did this man get elected? And it must be because a large portion of Canadian voters thought it was a good idea. So that's what's really scary.
It's turned for him. I think I was reading that for the first time in decades and decades and decades, the conservatives are ahead of the liberals in the polls in every single age bracket. And then they put out this budget that was basically designed to buy votes from younger demographics, and it didn't sway the younger demographics. And it's interesting because today's I guess we call them Zoomers, Generation Z, here in Canada, which we really have never seen with young people, they're now leaning conservative, which is something that's kind of new. And I think that's what happens when you've got a left-leaning government that is so badly out of control that if you were a young person in Canada, and here's a great example. A friend of mine who's partner at an accounting firm told me that when they hire entry-level accountants, so just people just out of school, they pay them $45,000 a year. Guess what? They were still paying them $45,000 a year 20 years ago, except now to go and rent a condo in Toronto or a one bedroom used to be like $1,200 a month. Today, it's going to run you $2,700 a month. So you can't afford to live in the city on that job. I don't even know if you could afford to live with roommates. So I understand why young people, they're looking around and they're just legitimately pissed off at how this government's failed them.
If I was a young Canadian, and this is advice that I give to young people in the US and Europe as well, I'd get the hell out of Canada. Okay, fine. Where do you go? And in order to get the hell out, you need to have accumulated a certain amount of capital. And where would I go? What would I do then? Well, first of all, you're very lucky. One way the Canadians are lucky, much luckier than Americans, are that once you leave Canada, you are out from under the thumb of the Canadian government. You don't have to pay taxes anymore. So now, unlike an American is obligated to pay taxes and file a lot of other forms every year for the rest of his life, even if he never returns to the US. So Canadians are much better off in that respect than Americans. So now I'm a young Canadian person. I've left. I'm free of that albatross around my neck. Where am I going to go? What am I going to do? Well, the good news is having grown up in a Western country, probably having a good education, and basically good values that you might have gotten, you've got to take the show on the road and go someplace where you can bring something to the party. If I was a young Canadian, I would go to Africa. And people say, what? Are you crazy? Go to Africa? That's the bottom of the barrel. And it is. That's true. But if you want to succeed in life, you want to go someplace where it's not a level playing field, but you want to go someplace where you're at the high end of the unlevel playing field. And if you look for opportunities in Africa, you'll find that you have capital, you have connections, you have knowledge, you have unique experiences that the locals don't have. So that it's possible in many African countries, I've been to many African countries, to go someplace to rise quickly. Whereas if you stay in Canada, You're just one of millions of other people just like you on a sinking ship. So, despite all the problems that a country like Africa has, that's what I do. I would boldly strike out. Now, that might be a little bit too bold for most listeners, but I think that's the direction that they ought to be thinking.
So let's change gears here and talk a little bit about what's happening in the world. Since we last spoke, there's some pretty big developments with Iran sending drones and ballistic missiles over at Israel. When we look at what's happening in the world, and we look at what's happened with Russia and Ukraine, and we look at what's happening with Iran and Israel, it kind of feels to me, and I can walk you through it all chronologically to build the case, but I'm assuming I don't need to do that. It seems like there's a few of these countries working together. I don't know how many, but clearly China, Russia, Iran. And there's a concerted effort to try to dethrone the US dollar and try to create their own economic dominance, or move up the economic ladder. Do you think that that's happening here? Do you think China, Russia, and Iran
Yes,
and is it inevitable that China's going into Taiwan?
of course it's happening. Because do you know what the major export of the United States is? Offhand, do you know?
I assume it's the US dollar.
That's correct. Everybody thinks, well, is it Boeing's? Is it wheat? No, it's the US dollar. And for the last 40 years, that's a long time, that has been the case. The US is in a uniquely good position where we print up dollars and the nice foreigners send us Mercedes and Sonys and so forth and take this paper dollar. Uh, but that's coming to an end, frankly, both because the dollar is becoming a hot potato. When you create roughly 2 trillion more dollars every year from out of nothing, it's going to lose value. And that's what's happening. I don't trust the inflation figures, incidentally, that the US government puts out much more than I trust the inflation figures of Argentina, where I am right now. They're artificially low. So at some point, people all around the world are going to stop accepting the US dollar. And that certainly includes the Russians. Uh, they don't want to use US dollars. The Chinese don't want to use US dollars. Why use the currency of your adversary, where if you're going to trade with it, uh, all the trading goes through New York? That's that's really dumb and dangerous. So yes, the U.S. dollar is going to be replaced. In fact, just the other day, the U.S. government announced that Chinese banks that deal with Russians uh, will be put under stringent controls by the U.S. And if I was a Chinese banker, I would say, what right does the U.S. have to tell me who I can borrow and lend from and deal with? So, of course, they want to get rid of the US dollar. And when that happens, you're going to find scores of trillions of US dollars that are owned by foreigners that are going to be dumped wholesale. But dumped to whom? They're going to be dumped back into the US, and prices will explode upwards. And the titles of land and companies and businesses will be transferred to foreigners. So the US, which has been having an artificially high standard of living for many years, is going to go into a very real depressed standard of living. So, sorry to give you a kind of a lecture on that and go on, but
Do you think that this is going to be a gradual thing, that we just sort of see the US dollar continue to lose sort of its value over time? Or do you think that there's going to be an event, like one day China announces that they're going to be, working with Russia and India or something to that effect, like with the BRICS, and they're going to be pegging everything to gold, and China's got all these gold holdings that they're going to announce that they have, or I don't know, some sort of economic event that we're going to wake up one day and the US dollar is going to lose like 90% of its value?
possible. It's like Ernest Hemingway said, how do you go bankrupt? slowly, and then all of a sudden. So it could very well be that way, yes. And Canada, as we were talking about earlier, is in a worse position because of the way the government is managing things, the fact that they can manage things to start with. It's even in a worse position than the U.S. So it's a real problem. And you were talking earlier about the wars in the Middle East, and I would say that the U.S., or I should say, not the U.S., the average American doesn't approve of these things, has no control over them. Let's say Washington, D.C., and the people in Washington, D.C. Are really at cause and at fault for a lot of the problems that we have in the world today. The war in the Ukraine with Russia should never have happened. And the US basically fomented that war and continues and enables it to continue at the cost of hundreds of thousands of deaths of Ukrainian soldiers and Russian soldiers. The same thing is true with Israel and Gaza. If the Israelis weren't being supported by Washington, and of course you know that Washington just passed a bill giving another $60 billion to Ukraine. That's all going to be stolen and wasted, and $20 billion to Israel. Well, and I forget how much they were going to give to Taiwan, which is provoking the Chinese. Washington is in back of most of the troubles we have in the world today. It's strange because we're all used to thinking of America from the days of Superman, truth, justice, and the American way. That's all gone. The country's changed.
It's things are changing pretty fast. Here's another question that we came up with that I'd like to get your thoughts on. TikTok. There was a bill that's been passed in, I believe, both the House and the Senate that the investors in TikTok, which right now is China, TikTok US and ByteDance, they are going to effectively say that needs to be owned by Americans. It can't be owned by China anymore, or else we're going to ban TikTok from all the different app stores. Do you think China's used? What do you think's happening there?
Well, first of all, personal opinion on TikTok. I've watched it any number of times. It's quite amusing. Is it full of Chinese propaganda? Well, not the feed that I get. It's just fun and amusing. Time killer. Okay. So, and I understand, I don't know if this is true, that Chinese TikTok is more uplifting, not just fun things about, cats and crazy things or whatever you get here, but it's more uplifting, often with some scientific or educational content. Well, maybe not. I don't know. But the US government should not get into the business of telling Americans what they can and cannot watch, frankly. And the passport that the owner of a business carries, this is for the market to decide and for Americans to decide, not bureaucrats in Washington to decide. And of course, America is going to shoot itself in the foot because who's going to want to put money and invest in the US when they come to realize that if I carry the wrong passport, my business or my assets can be stolen from me, like Russians. The average Russian could have his assets and has had his assets in the US confiscated. This could happen to the Chinese too, where they have to sell at a cheaper price than what it's worth. So, no, you don't want to invest in America. It used to be a great place. Say, no matter where you are in the world, you leave your shithole country and you place $1 in the US. Well, at least that's safe. At least that'll grow. But now you can't really go to America anymore either. It's a real problem. Where do you go at this point?
So since we last spoke, gold has done very well. I know it's down a little bit over the last week, but we did get over $2,400. And copper has really been on a bit of a run. Uh, I got to get your thoughts here. What's your assessment of what's happening right now with copper and gold?
Uh, Commodities in general are very, very cheap today. Uh, so I'm very friendly towards commodities in general today, and especially towards gold and copper. Well, uranium is another one that I think is going to go much higher for different reasons. Oil, natural gas, I think they're both headed higher for different reasons. But even though gold is at a new all-time high in dollar terms, in real terms, it's not. The previous all-time high in gold occurred way back in 1980 when it hit $850 per ounce. But in today's dollars, officially, that would be about, by the CPI, would be about 3,400 or something on that order. But the CPI is understated. To go back to its previous high, I think gold's going to have to go to $3,800 just to reach its high from 1980. But the world situation is much more serious now than it was back in 1980. So gold could, I think we're at the start of a new major bull market in gold. And copper, of course, is a different story. Uh, I'm bullish. I'm bullish on copper. You look at it in real terms. Back in the 70s, when copper was kind of dead as a duck, it was trading in the 30s. Okay. And today, in real terms, copper's at a low. I mean, just because looking at things in terms of dollars is confusing. It's about as smart as an Argentine looking at prices in terms of pesos. It's meaningless, increasingly meaningless, I should say. So I'm bullish on both gold and copper stocks, and they're both very cheap. I mean, look, the all-in sustaining cost, and we can talk about what actual costs are and all that about gold mines, right now is about $1,300 an ounce for producing mines. Gold's 20, it's $1,000 an ounce that you're putting in your bank free and clear. Those are good margins. But gold companies, relative to the price of gold, are at about their cheapest level in history.
Why do you think it is that we're not seeing more capital flow into the gold names right now?
Because gold mining is historically a crappy business. Okay, it's a 19th century choo-choo train business. Did you ever watch the series Deadwood?
I've not.
It's the best thing that's been produced since Shakespeare. I urge people to look it up on HBO. Who did that series? I forget. It ran for 3 years. It centers around Deadwood, South Dakota in the 1870s when the Homestake mine was discovered. And in those days, when you discovered a gold mine, it was like finding a gold mine. Your fortune was made. Today, from the time you make a discovery, and of course, making a discovery will cost millions of dollars on an Easter egg hunt that you probably won't succeed at, then it'll take 10 years for permitting to allow you to mine it. Then you got to raise more money to develop, and then you got to raise more money to produce. And then when you're in production, NGOs will attack you, natives will attack you, the government will treat you as a milk cow. Gold mining is a rough, terrible business. So don't wonder the gold stocks are cheap, but it's worse than that because gold, any kind of mining, is not ESG and DEI compliant, generally speaking. And you're raping Mother Earth, they think, so that pension funds and BlackRock and these kind of people don't want to invest in mining companies in general. Yeah, they're under-owned and they're very cheap, which, to my way of thinking, is a great reason to own them because these people are dead wrong. And at some point, the public is going to pile into mining stocks in general, and I think gold mining stocks in particular, because since gold was freed from the US government's price control at $35 an ounce in 1971, gold has done just fine. I mean, I've done most of my saving in gold instead of saving dollars, buy gold coins and put them away. And it's been just fine. Thank you very much. But with gold going higher, the public is going to get back into gold stocks. So regardless, I'm very bullish on gold stocks. Since 1971, what I was going to say is there have been 5 major bull markets. And in each of those bull markets, the average gold stock has run 10 to 1. That's a lot. A long period of, in paleontology, we say punctuated disequilibrium. Long time doing nothing, long time going down, then it explodes. This has happened 5 times. It'll happen again with gold. And so I'm very long junior producers, even in Canada, with all its problems.
Well, Doug, you've been very generous with your time today, and I appreciate you hopping on here. For our audience who wants more of your commentary, where can they go to?
Well, go to internationalman.com. We have, it's a daily free blog. It's a spectacular blog with great articles on all kinds of good things. So go to internationalman.com. I have a podcast with my friend Matt Smith that we do twice a week, and that's called Doug Casey's Take on YouTube. Go there. And there's a third source, too, that I'd mentioned to you. Well, read my novels. I like to promote my novels. I've written 10 books, but the novels I think are relevant. They're called Speculator, Drug Lord, and Assassin, part of a series of 7 reforming unjustly besmirched and highly politically incorrect occupations. So go to Amazon and get those if you like what I've been saying.
Hey, well, Doug, thanks so much for hopping on here. It's always a hit with our audience. They always love when you take the time to hop on here. And I look forward to chatting with you again when we see this gold and copper rally continue to grab legs. And I think that there's going to be a lot more interesting conversations on junior mining as we continue to see momentum in this market.
Yeah, and let's hope that these idiots don't start World War III in between now and the time we chat again.
Yeah, let's hope so. Thanks so much for hopping on, Doug.
Pleasure.
All right, everyone. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this interview, please smash that like button, subscribe, and ring that notification bell. Also, let me know what you think in the comment section. Thanks, everyone.